Okay, welcome everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning. This is the TDWG Webinar Series, and this is the episode, The Evolution of Biodiversity Information Standards, Part 2, How Community Standards Develop and Evolve. I thank you all for joining us in this session. I'm Paula Zermoglio. I'm greeting you from Bariloche, Argentina, and I'll be moderating this session. Our speakers today are Stan Blum, the TDWG administrator, and Steve Baskauf from Vanderbilt University Libraries and TDWG. They will share with us the process by which standards are developed and maintained. And with some examples from the latest Darwin Core Public review, they will illustrate how anyone who is interested in the community can get engaged in these processes and contribute to standards evolution. So with that, Stan, the floor is yours.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen and present. So I'm going to handle part one of this and talk about the TDWG process as it is formally prescribed in the TDWG bylaws. And that's going to take the first 15 minutes or so. And then the next chunk is going to be by Steve Baskauf, who's going to talk about the vocabulary maintenance standard before we get into talking about examples. So I'm going to talk in essence about the early days. So a little bit of background about TDWG. It's a fairly old organization. It was founded in 1985. So as far as data standards organizations, that's pretty early. The significant thing there is that it was pre-internet. And without the ability to transfer files back and forth, except by 360K floppy disks or something like that, the whole notion of data integration was in theory. There was definitely an eye towards data integration in the future, but without the internet, there was really no test of compliance. So the internet made that data integration possible, and with that, standards became critical infrastructure. And the way that standards had been viewed before is just how to do something properly really wasn't sufficient. We really needed to have a more stringent sort of approach with some more serious tests on how to build standards and to get them to work together and make sure that they are of high quality and that people were following them if they were trying to do data integration. So we began to look at other bodies and how they operated, and in particular, we were primarily attracted to the IETF as a very sort of internet culture. That's the Internet Engineering Task Force, which basically has created a lot of the basic internet protocols. And the other one that we looked at was the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, which is a bit more of a top-down sort of affair with kind of a different approach to the organization and membership and things like that. I wrote a position paper in 2000 as the internet was getting to be about 10 years old, and TDWG was really needing to up the game, and in comparing these other two organizations with what we were doing, we sort of set out how we probably should try to do things and began thinking about reorganizing. However, that incubated for a few years, and it wasn't until we got funding from the Moore Foundation in the form of the TDWG Infrastructure Project, which ran from 2005 to 2007 with Donald Hoburn as the PI, that enabled us to hire 3 full-time staff for a year, 2.5 years, Lee Belbin, Roger Hyam, and Ricardo Pereira. And so one of the first things we did was to set about revising the Constitution and the bylaws. So the Constitution kept a similar structure, just a little bit of unhooking things from the annual meeting. There was too much of a drumbeat focused on the annual meeting, and we changed it so that we could do things continuously throughout the year and move to electronic voting and things like that. But the Constitution lays out the sort of managing organization, if you will. So the executive committee is the key body, manages day-to-day activities, ensures financial integrity, governmental compliance, those sorts of things, and in particular is charged with managing the standards efforts to ensure fairness and competence. They do other things, organize the annual meeting, and then they have the power to appoint other roles and delegate tasks as needed. The Constitution also sets forth how we vote on things. We try to do standards development by consensus, not so much by voting. But there are things that do have to be voted on. And then there are amendments that lays out the procedure for amending the Constitution as well as amending or modifying the bylaws. So broadly speaking, what the executive committee's role is to ensure socio-political integrity and operational competence. And that's in contrast to technical competence, which is going to be a charge of the technical advisory group, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But so the social and the scientific domain are the purview of the executive committee. The bylaws is where the standards process was laid out. And this is in particular what we were trying to look at and to revise anew from what we saw in IETF and W3C. But we are also trying to fix what we thought was a kind of a passive approach by the members to standards proposals. And what we were missing was the kind of really thorough critical review that could come from expert review that were engaged like an editor would solicit reviews from experts in publishing a paper. So the organizational piece that the bylaws lay out, though, is about interest groups. How do we form interest groups, manage them, and how do interest groups go forward with specific tasks? So generally, much like in IETF or W3C, interest groups are people that coalesce around a particular topic and are basically trying to achieve integration and interoperability with particular kinds of data or a particular part of biodiversity science. A critical thing in terms of the organization is interest groups don't have a sunset, not an automatic one. They stay active as long as the members demonstrate interest and stay active. And they are responsible, in the initial prescription that we made, the interest group would be responsible for maintaining any product of its task groups. That's also something that we've tweaked a bit, and it got tweaked in the future. And task groups are formed within an interest group to develop a specific product within a particular time frame, and then they dissolve when the task is done. The bylaws can be seen on the TDWG website, and they're under the About and Process path up there that you see up at the top. And down here at the bottom, I have a link to the TDWG community where we've listed all of the currently active interest in task groups. So establishing an interest or task group is done by writing a charter and having it approved by the executive committee. There's a link here to charters and some of the responsibilities of interest and task group conveners. So this approval process is where the executive, in essence, gets to exercise its coordination and management influence, basically asking that particular modifications or changes in plans get made. And then if an interest group or task group is not making progress, there's a provision in the process that directive that the exec should disband or restructure any such sleeping interest or task group. That's because we don't want people sort of sitting and blocking progress. If somebody's gone to sleep and other people in the community would really like to make this happen, we want to get the sleepers out of the way and let the active folks come forward. Okay, so the ratification process then is that a task group submits through its interest group to the executive committee a working draft of a standard. The executive committee takes a quick look at it to see if everything is in order, and if it's ready to be reviewed, then they appoint a review manager and engage an expert review. And the review happens, the comments come back in, the review manager can take those directly back to the task group if there were modifications. Anyway, the result of that whole review process then is a recommendation or a report to the executive committee, which then determines whether it has, comments have been addressed and the proposed standard is ready to be submitted to public review. We use a 30-day period for public review. It's typically done on GitHub, and the review manager stays in place to handle sort of anonymous comments and things like that. Again, once that public review closes, the review manager assembles a report, submits it to the executive committee, and a decision is made. Does it all look good, or are there still further things that need to be done? Or then do we just ratify the standard and publish it as such? In which case, we then move to the maintenance phase. All right, so we have an interest group, and it has created a task group, which then created a standard, which got ratified, and then it dissolved the interest group, the task group. So then what we said earliest was that, well, the task group is really part of the interest group. So the standard is obviously part of the interest group, and it then is their responsibility, to maintain that ratified standard. But we found in practice that some interest groups and the standards they produced didn't really, they weren't sort of curated by the whole interest group. The scope of the interest group was very broad. The standard was more narrow, or there were alternative things being worked on. And so in order to make the people who created the standard and were most invested in it, and enable them to operate their interest group or maintenance group as they see fit, we basically can recharter either the whole thing or a part of that interest group as a maintenance group, which then has the sole responsibility of maintaining that ratified standard. So the other thing that I mentioned earlier was the technical architecture group. The technology is complicated and ever changing, and it's a challenge to keep up. So we definitely like to engage technical experts with our community, and to, in essence, have them be a sort of a technical resource for the executive and for the interest and task groups. So formally, the executive can call upon the tag to review a charter or to review a standard, and receive feedback as whether it's compliant with what we're the sort of methods and more generic kinds of technologies that are being used to do information integration. So their charge is to ensure that each proposed standard, as well as the overall standards architecture, is technically sound. Another task, which is done in theory, is to provide a technical roadmap for TDWG. In essence, pointing to the current emerging standards for data integration and interoperability. We originally conceived of the tag as an interest group, but in the most recent revision of the Constitution in 2016, we recast that as a standing committee. The primary difference there is that the convener of the tag is now an elected office and serves on the executive committee. And you can find the homepage or the charter of the tag at that link there. So that is the basic TDWG process. And looks great in theory, but it's hard in practice. It takes a lot of work. But ultimately, I have found the work very rewarding, and I believe it does make a difference. And with that, I will turn this over to Steve, unless there are any other, well, I'll do that anyway, and then
Thank you
if there are
very
any
much,
questions.
Stan. I don't see any questions in the chat so far, nor in our notes document. To everyone
I will be
present.
around later, so I'll be at the end too.
Excellent. So we'll pass it to Steve.
All right, thank you. So my name's Steve Baskauf, and I am fairly heavily involved in the vocabulary maintenance process because I'm the convener of the Audubon Core Maintenance Group, and I also serve on the Darwin Core Maintenance Group. And so I'm going to focus talking today about the vocabulary maintenance specification, which I was the lead author on. So I'm quite familiar with the details of that. So there are basically three standards that govern, or three documents that govern standards. One is the TDWG process document, which Dan talked about. The standards documentation specification says how standards should be presented. We're not going to talk about that today. The third one, which is the vocabulary maintenance specification, governs how vocabularies are managed. And I should note that I put in the notes document a link to this PowerPoint, and the PowerPoint is loaded with a bunch of links. So if you're curious about any more details, I have a lot of links. You can download the PowerPoint and check it out because I'm not going to look at all of them. So just a brief bit of history. When Darwin Core, which was the first first vocabulary standard to be adopted under the process, the modern process that Stan described, came with its own document that described how changes should be made to it. And they were basically Darwin Core specific. But it became apparent that there were some issues with that. They didn't work well. They didn't say how documents should change. So there was some discussion about having a TDWG-wide vocabulary maintenance process. And so a Audubon Core, which was the second standard, didn't come with its own maintenance process, because there was an assumption that there would be a TDWG-wide one. So a task group that I led was chartered in 2015. In 2017, it was finished. And soon afterwards, in 2017, the Darwin Core Maintenance Group was chartered. And in 2018, the Audubon Core Maintenance Group was chartered. So it basically became put into effect for those two vocabulary standards. And I should mention that the vocabulary maintenance specification is really written about managing vocabularies, and it's a bit unclear how changes to non-vocabulary standards should be handled. So that's kind of an open issue. So I'm going to use a few terms here that I want to define. The first one is normative, and normative parts of standards are the parts that define the standard and prescribe how it should be implemented. There are also parts of text and term metadata that are included in the standards that are not normative. So that's informative information, things like examples and so on, that help people to understand the standard, but they don't prescribe how to follow it. There are actually some documents that the maintenance groups might create that aren't actually a part of the standard, and those are not regulated by any process at all. So the vocabulary maintenance specification applies only to documents and vocabularies that are within the standard itself. So I'm going to talk about the main bits of the vocabulary maintenance specification. The document's not actually that long. It's only a few pages long, but it's a bit of a slog to read through. So I'll just hit the high points here. One of the things, as Stan mentioned, is that the vocabulary maintenance specification creates a special kind of interest group called a vocabulary maintenance group, or just maintenance group, or maintenance interest group, but often the interest part's just dropped out and it's just called the maintenance group. And the difference between that and a normal interest group is it can't go away. A normal interest group, if there's no interest, it can fade away, but somebody has to maintain the vocabulary. So If the convener of the group is unable or unwilling to continue doing that, then someone else gets appointed by the executive. And a lot of the roles that are played by the review manager in the process that Stan described then actually fall upon the maintenance group to make decisions about moving change requests through the process. And one of the improvements over the Darwin Core process is that it was made clear that the maintenance group has some discretion about how much of the full change process needs to be used. So for example, if there's within a standards document, if there's a bad URL or something wrong in an example, the maintenance group can just change that. They don't have to get permission or go through any process. If there is significant change to non-normative content, it doesn't necessarily require the full change process, but the maintenance group should inform the community about those changes. The time when the actual full change process has to be implemented is anytime normative content gets changed. And this is a more odious process, takes a lot longer. So that's why we try to not have to change normative content very often if we can help it. Now, anyone can propose changes to the standard, to the vocabulary. And so it falls on the maintenance group to make decisions about whether those changes are justified. And there's 3 criteria that the maintenance group uses: demand, efficacy, and stability. So the demand requirement basically asks the question, are there at least 2 or more independent parties who say that they need this change? If so, it meets that requirement. The efficacy requirement means that the person proposing the change needs to demonstrate that it'll actually work, that it'll accomplish the purpose for which it was proposed. And then the 3rd criteria is stability. If it's likely that the change will break existing things, then it has to be looked at more carefully. Either change the existing practice or make the proposed change fit in with existing practices. So in a nutshell, the full change process looks something like this. It's similar to the standard ratification process in that a change is proposed, but instead of the executive or a review manager deciding on the suitableness of this change, it's the maintenance group that does that. So they check to see whether the proposed change meets those 3 requirements. If it doesn't, it gets sent back to the proposer to fix, or if there's insufficient interest, sometimes it's just closed. If the maintenance group feels that that the proposal is ready, it will then initiate a public comment period. And a lot of times the maintenance group will do this with a group of term requests because it's kind of a pain to run through the public comment period. And so in order to sort of avoid proposals from languishing for a long time, we're generally trying at least once a year or twice a year to have a public comment period for pending proposals. If there is no consensus on the proposed changes, then the 3 things can happen. One is the issue can just get closed if it looks like it's just not going to fly. Another possibility is if it looks like it's close to flying, then the clock can be reset, particularly if there are revisions made to the proposal, then those revised proposals can get another 30 days of public comment. But another thing that's happened more recently is that it has been recognized that the proposal is just too complicated to work out in a public comment forum. And in that case, the maintenance group may request that the proposers try to create a task group to go back and work out the details. But assuming that consensus is achieved, then it goes on to an executive decision. And the executive is not so much judging the technical merits, because that presumably has been done in the earlier stages, but they are basically looking to make sure that the process was followed properly, that there was consensus, that people weren't excluded from the process, and so on. And if the executive agrees that those things were done acceptably, then they adopt the standard and it becomes added to the documentation for that standard. So I'm going to pause for just a second here to see if there's any questions, and then I'm going to show you some examples from previous or recent changes.
And so far, we don't have any questions, Steve, in the
Okay,
chat. No,
great.
okay.
So I'm going to show you some examples of situations where some proposals took these different pathways. So one of these was a proposed term, etymology, and this was a term that basically did not have enough people who supported it, and it died from lack of demand. Another example is the term biome, and that was one that passed the first bar. So these links lead to the term proposal pages. And so if you download the PowerPoint and click on them, you can sort of see the path that was taken. So for biome, you could see there was like quite a lot of discussion about it. But the conclusion in the end was that this was just not going to get resolved by this kind of online or GitHub discussion. And so it was recommended that this was a proposal that needed a task group. And so that proposal did not die. It's actually sitting there waiting for someone to take the initiative to create a task group and then try to fix the deficiencies that were noted during the public comment period. Another term that didn't quite make it was subgenus. And this one actually went through the first 30 days and then got revised in an attempt to achieve consensus. The clock was reset. It did another 30 days, but there still was not consensus. This one is basically in term limbo. So it's sort of waiting for someone to figure out how to gain consensus on it. And so in the past, we had situations where a lot of terms proposals ended up in proposal limbo. And so this is sort of why we established this idea that the maintenance groups at least once a year would go through the issue tracker. And if it turns out that nobody really wants to take this up, then it should just be closed. It's not really fair to the proposers of the changes to leave them hanging for a long period of time. They should get some sort of closure. Now, an example of a proposal that actually made it through the process. This is an example from Audubon Core. This was a proposal to import from a different vocabulary the term music ontology sample rate. And so there were two people who were sound metadata people who made the proposal. And as you can see here, this is the public comment period. There was very little comment. It sailed right through and nobody had an issue with it. And it is now a part of Audubon Core. So that's exciting. That's what we like to see. An example of another proposal that made it through the process was the Darwin Core proposal material citation. If you look at the issue tracker for that one, you can see that it was a rather extensive discussion and a lot of back and forth. I think some revising of the exact definitions, but in the end, it was complete, implemented, and it is now a part of Darwin Core. So those are sort of some of the different paths that simple term changes like that can take. Now, sometimes people propose changes that are a lot more complicated. So the sort of basic layer of a TDWG vocabulary is what we call the bag of terms, which is just basically terms and their definitions and examples and things like that. The vocabulary maintenance specification comes up with this a second layer that could be put on top of the bag of terms called vocabulary enhancement. So this could be some more complicated changes that involve multiple terms. It could be adding of semantic layers on top of the bag of terms. It may be restrictions that a particular part of the community would like to place on the use of the basic terms. And because this is complicated, it's really not something that you can work out through the change process in the issue tracker. And so generally, these kinds of more complicated proposals are either done by a task group that's been chartered by the maintenance group, or they can also arise spontaneously from the community, as was the case with the controlled vocabularies for pathway and establishment means. So, either of those processes can happen, but it's more organized than just putting something in the issue tracker. So the vocabulary maintenance specification sets two requirements for these more complicated changes. And this is in the form of reports. So it's not very specific about what has to be in the report, but basically the feature report, in the feature report, you have to explain what the proposed changes are supposed to accomplish and how do those goals constrain the requirements of the change. And so this could consist of like a list of formal requirements. And then once the proposers have worked out how this vocabulary enhancement is, how they think it's going to work, then they should undergo testing and be able to report what the results were of people who actually tried to implement it. And this is, again, something that...
Steve,
yeah.
I think we're still seeing the issue tracker.
I'm sorry, I forgot to
we're
click.
wondering if, yeah.
Yep, thank you. Sorry, forgot it. Yeah, so anyway, this is something that was sort of borrowed from the IETF and the W3C. And the idea was that when the proposals would come to be brought before, to be taken to public comment, the people could look at all this information and it would not have to be hashed out during the actual review process. Okay, so I see a hand. Is that actually a question or no? I guess maybe that was for me to change my screen. Okay, so I'm just going to mention a couple examples where this has actually happened. The only situation we've had where this has been completely carried through is with the chronometric age extension to Darwin Core. So there was an earlier non-TDWG vocabulary by Zoo ArcNet. And the goal of this group was to bring that into conformance with the standards of Darwin Core and get it brought in as an extension. And so there was a task group that worked on this. And then John Wajorek is the first person to actually create a feature report with no previous examples to look at. And so as you can see, this feature report is not very long, but it lays out what the features were that they were trying to accomplish. And then it has some references to support that. The other part then, after completing this, they had some members of the community try to implement this. And so here's the implementation experience report, which includes a description of how it was implemented. And then there's also a list of the members of the community who were successfully able to implement it and some references. So this is sort of the first example that we have of this, and it sailed right through the public review because a lot of the legwork had been done ahead of time. The other example that we have is not completed. Sorry, I didn't mean to click that. It is one of the task groups of Audubon Core, which is to develop some controlled vocabularies. So this is a task group that's met. We've had 15 video calls and In this case, we started off by asking the community to submit use cases. And so we have actually a use case repository. This is a listing, categorized listing of all the use cases that people submitted. And what we did was use that to create candidate requirements. So those candidate requirements then were used after we developed the controlled vocabularies to cut out the requirements that we couldn't actually achieve and just leave the ones that were achievable. And so we're now at the stage of trying to figure out how to prepare the implementation experience report. So we're still working on that, and that one's not done. Now, sometimes there are situations where they're not quite complicated enough to be a in this category of vocabulary enhancement. So an example, this was the regions of interest proposal that was recently came up in Audubon Core. So this was actually a set of terms that were sort of related to each other, but they weren't like a really full-blown vocabulary enhancement. And so the maintenance group basically decided that that they didn't need a task group, and the maintenance group itself basically got some experts in, did some research, and then developed the proposal between February and March of this year. And so one of the things that we did, which was not quite a full one of these reports, but a new sort of experimental thing, which we called a recipe, which basically shows people this is how you can use these sets of terms with each other. And this is not a document that's intended to be a part of the standard. It's really just an informative thing. So that has gone through public comment, and we are waiting for an executive decision on that proposal. So those are just a few examples, and I will wrap things up here with some conclusions of what I think we've learned from a number of years now of trying to implement this process. One of the things is that in order for this process to work successfully, the maintenance group members have to understand how the process works. And it also requires leadership from the convener to really keep the ball rolling. That's really who it falls upon to keep these steps moving forward. The other thing that has really been worked out from the School of Hard Knocks is to figure out how to do the tracking and documentation infrastructure. And for this, you'll notice in all of the examples I gave there in the GitHub issue tracker. And so we've developed templates for issues submission and so on. And this has really helped streamline the process of managing the proposals and keeping track of where everything is and what needs to happen. And then we also had some sort of behind the scenes infrastructure that needed to be built once the changes were ratified to actually get them into the documentation. From the standpoint of the contributors, the important things are to really identify and communicate with the constituency who's going to care about that proposal prior to proposing it. In the cases where people have really checked that there's support of their proposal, these are the ones that are usually successful. The ones that are just sort of randomly thrown in the issue tracker without this kind of background work often end up getting stuck. And if you can demonstrate efficacy prior to submission, especially for the more complicated things, that is really going to streamline the process. The last thing is that the more complicated the changes you're proposing, the more preparation that you need to have. So an individual minor term change really doesn't require much preparation, but something like a giant set of term additions that are coordinated, you might actually need a task group to do that. So I am going to stop at this point. I have one more slide, which is sort of some questions that I have about the future of this process, but I think I can defer on that, whether we have time for that later.
Thank you very much, Steve and Stan, for these great presentations. We don't have questions yet in the chat or in the document, but maybe if people want to just ask and open the microphones, we can do that now. Just don't be shy. And I have a question for the audience, actually, and that is if there is anyone here that works with development or management of standards from other organizations or initiatives, and if you want to share your processes with us and see where we have commonalities or where you see strengths or weaknesses in your process or ours, and maybe we can do some exchange of ideas of experiences. Questions, comments? Deborah, I see your hand up.
Yeah. Hi, Paula. Thanks,
Hi.
Steve and Stanley, for the presentation. I'm not a standard developer, so it's not a reaction to your question, Paula. It's more a comment. TDWG has been successful in the development of standards, and I would like to know, considering everything that you presented and all those decades of work, if you believe the community is engaged enough with the development, or is there something still that perhaps can be done to engage more? Do you see the same faces coming, or are new people jumping in? And well, maybe I should present myself. I work in RAPA in Brazil. It's a research institution on agriculture. And I've been connected with the interest group on interaction data. And we have a long way to go until all those processes are gone through. So that's what I would like to hear. How do you believe people engage, and if they could engage more?
Yeah, can I answer that?
Please do.
Yeah, so I think that in some cases, like anything basically related to taxonomy, there's never any shortage of people who are interested in talking about it. But there are some other topics. You know, the Audubon Core group every year has sort of a meeting at the annual meeting where we ask people, like, what do they see missing from Audubon Core? And you know, we had several people who said, we don't know how to deal with sound and video. So we actively went out and looked for or recruited people who were in the sound, the bioacoustics field, and twisted their arms to get involved in the group. So I think that part of the success, especially for developing these sort of new areas in which the standard is going, to be successful, you can't really the maintenance group can't just sort of hope somebody is going to show up. In some cases, they may need to solicit participation. I mean, the other thing which we did is, you know, there were some people that we knew who could give us information and guide us in the process, but that they were too busy to actually be a part of the group. And so we invited particular people. We were looking a lot at IIIF, the International Image Interoperability Framework, and it was something Audubon Core felt was important, but we didn't know about. And we had 2 people come to our meetings and basically talk. One person was from IIIF, and another person was someone who's been using it in the biodiversity context. So I think it is definitely good for the maintenance groups to reach out and try to find people who can help them. I mean, it's sort of like the expert reviewers that get called in for the standards development process. So we can sort of bring in experts to help us if we have questions about the maintenance or development.
I'd like to add that TDWG used to have, back when it was almost purely a botanical organization, it used to have an interest group, so to speak, and actually had a standard, and one of the early ones back in the 90s, I think, on economic botany. I don't know if that's relevant to your field or not. I'm not terribly familiar with it. I just know that it was part of the TDWG legacy. There has been some interaction with the Biodiversity group that's works with FAO and Montpellier with Elizabeth Arnaud. She helped to host a TDWG meeting once in Montpellier. And we've had a few other people that are sort of agriculturally inclined, some of them with seed bank efforts and a few others. And one of our past chairs is actually now at the Agricultural Library, Cindy Parr. And she's telling us that after a little bit of a hiatus that she's ready to get back involved again more and to try and wrap in more agricultural things. So you might find that there are people of interest. It is nice when we can all get together physically and you can come and meet people and talk in the hallways and have coffee and beers and whatever. It's a little bit more difficult when we're trying to do all of this virtually, but I would say it's definitely within the scope of what TDWG hopes to cover. So you'd be more than welcome. Hope you can find some friends.
Thank you very much. Thank you too. I am working with Cindy on this pollinator idea of development. So hope we will be successful enough to evolve, and Paula is also getting closer to us. That's something we are very grateful also. Thank you.
So I would just like to say, I did not start at TDWG as an insider. I just showed up one time, a decade ago or whatever, and was interested and willing to do work. And I found TDWG is like a super welcoming place. I never felt that people, looked down on me because I didn't know enough or whatever. They were very happy to help me understand how to do things. So and there's so much work that needs to be done. We'd love to have people get actively involved.
Yeah, I want to say similarly, I did the same thing in 1998. I showed up at, it wasn't my first one, it was my second TDWG meeting, and thought that some of what I was seeing was kind of crazy and that there must be better ways to do things. And so I didn't like what I saw, so I changed it, so to speak. But it was also, I have to say that TDWG is the thing that's, comment a little bit on one of the examples that Steve showed was that the chronometric age extension thing came to us as a proposal that was already pretty baked, and there hadn't been, I don't think, a whole lot of activity at TDWG meetings. There hadn't been a chartered task group before the thing was done. And that kind of misses some of the opportunity that TDWG provides, which is to connect with people interested in the same topics, the same domain around the world. TDWG gives you an opportunity to expose that internationally and to bring together people at a global level, and that's a key benefit, I think, of what TDWG provides.
Thanks to both and to everyone who is participating. I saw Deb's hand up, and we also have a question from Ellie on the document. But Deb, you want to speak up?
Well, I just wanted to ask Deborah a question in return. With your question about engagement, are you wondering if we're looking for people or if we whose role is it to do that, to find the other groups? Like, where were you wondering about engagement?
Yeah, it was mostly a curiosity, because I've been hearing about TDWG for decades, and I am from a ecology background, and when I started working with data management, I thought, oh, this is only for collections, so that's not what I need. And I see that I was wrong. So, and we are putting together this project to develop further the work we've been doing with plant pollinator interactions, and we're going to need a lot of engagement. So that's mostly that curiosity.
Okay. No, it's a great question, and it's something I'm passionate about, and the people here who know me know that, and about making sure that we do our best to make sure that not only is it welcoming, but to let you know how much we need you, right? You need the people who need to use the standards. We need to be able to sit with you, and we need the once the standards are developed, implementation and adoption are the next hurdles. Just because they've been developed, you see that there was this slide that Steve showed about who actually went through the hoops of putting that standard into practice, right?
Adopting.
And so they're like different. It's one thing to add it to your software. That's kind of one layer, but are the people actually using it? And are they putting in the buckets in the what you expect? You know, is the data what you hope for? And so you need people who are all parts of the data pipeline, from the people who create the data to the people who manage the data and the people who use the data, and back again. So
I want to jump in here and say one more thing, and that is there was a line in one of my slides that I actually took out. It was something we didn't formalize, but it is mentioned in the IETF and some other things, and that is birds of a feather meetings. Does that expression make sense to you, Deborah? So people, birds of a feather, are those that are interested in the same area. We don't have a formal process for organizing birds of a feather meetings at conferences, but that's one of the things that might improve our ability to engage other communities is if we did that. But it's kind of like the birds of a feather meetings just happen at the conferences, and those people get together and decide to do something. But those initial conversations happen somewhat informally. But we have had like citizen science, for example, started as kind of birds of a feather, and is still kind of operating that way rather than as a fully fledged interest group. But they keep having meetings at the conferences, and people keep talking about it in presentations. So, and pollinators have been active, actually. Pollinator talks and papers, etc., have been given at TDWG for quite a few years.
That's great. Thank you very much. It's very welcoming messages.
So
I don't know if we want
pass
to.
to Elise.
Thanks, Paula. I don't know if we want to backtrack. Deb had actually given quite a good segue into my question, which is, do we have more of an opportunity, or are we taking enough opportunity to let the widest gamut of the community know about changes that are being made? Or do we think that we're missing bits of the community who might not? How do we actually get the information out that standards are changing and evolving, and as data managers or as software vendors or software providers, that there are new opportunities for recording new types of data or recording data in a slightly different way, because that, I guess, the flow on upwards is into the aggregators, and to get that data shared, we want to have the widest possible implementation of or adoption of the standards. And certainly I think for some data managers who may not review their data mapping sort of, oh yeah, I read Darwin Core back in, 2012 and haven't updated it since then. But they might find that Darwin Core is really quite different from how it was 9 years ago. That's more of a comment, but any comments back in return?
I've always wanted to engage the GBIF nodes, who are sort of formally an outreach toward the providers, and to coordinate things, and wanted them to always be engaged in the loop of, marshaling feedback and presenting it back to standards keepers. But certainly the other direction would be appropriate for what you were just mentioning, is like, trying to inform them of changes and help them along with remappings and anything else that might be necessary to get the data flowing correctly.
I think that there's an important role for the regional representatives there in TDWG. Even though it's a lot of work and to communicate with the nodes, I think it might be a way to divide it throughout the world instead of trying to do something centralized. Personally, I've tried to do so as the Latin American representative. I know it's difficult to communicate, and I know it's difficult to get feedback as well. So one may send messages, but there is a time where people have to think about it and process it internally, and so there is a big gap, a temporal gap, between when we implement changes at the TDWG level and when that actually reaches the community. So maybe we also have to be prepared for that lag somehow. But I think from the regional representatives, there might be some help there, or some opportunity. Sorry, Amanda.
Oh, it's okay. I come at this from, I'm a collections manager at the Smithsonian Natural History Museum in paleontology. So I'm coming at it from a slightly, from not the informatics centric way, but from the collections management way. And I was just talking with some colleagues earlier about the same thing, about like, how do we get our data standards out to the community? Like, it's one thing, when a group of us are meeting, within our discipline to say it, but how do we get it out, and we were talking about, taking it to the more specific community conferences and whatnot. We have an abstract in at TDWG about what our paleo digitization group is doing. And it's like, great, this is what our group is doing. That's fantastic. But eventually we're going to have to take what we're doing and what we're trying to do at TDWG, and we're going to have to feed it out into the community, and so we talked about some of our future goals being, all right, let's take this presentation that we're going to give at TDWG, next month, and how do we then morph it a little bit to present it at some of the other national conferences specific to the different paleo disciplines, to start getting that information out there to the researchers who are going to use the data, to the other collections managers who attend the conferences, and everything like that. So that's sort of another way to help spread that information to the community outside of TDWG.
Thanks, Amanda. Yes, it's a really good idea to try to reach out at least in small groups, little by little.
Margaret, you were gonna jump in? We were private chatting.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I don't feel like I have fully formed thoughts here. So I was kind of reluctant to, the conversation is really interesting. Thank you. I have a dual point of view. I'm actually one of the, I'm on the EML dev committee. So our process for adopting changes is, first of all, it's much slower. EML changes only about once a decade. It's also a narrower group and has fewer steps in general, but it seems to be working pretty well for EML, so I'm fine with that. The other role that I have is working with a lot of very diverse ecological data usually long-term time series, and trying to morph these into Darwin Core archives so that we can hook up these long-term data sets that are coming from places like LTER to GBIF. And just as far as, so the interesting part of this conversation to me was, how do changes to the, so mainly as a data manager and a coder, my main mode of finding things out is to go read the documentation. And that isn't always sufficient, I have found, but figuring out where the right answers are isn't always very easy either. So understanding how advice gets disseminated would be really useful to have.
Any thoughts, Paula, before I jump in? Did you want to add?
No, you want to jump in? Go ahead.
Okay, so first of all, thank you, Margaret. It's great to have your perspective from both of those points of view. Certainly, one thing that struck me about what Amanda said, and she knows that I mean, I'm familiar with what they're doing, but I know the rest of this group might not be. But one of the things I noted about implementation and adoption is it's not always that easy to tell what your neighbor is doing. It's not always that easy to see how they're, for example, implementing a standard or trying. And so this notion of what are other people in the paleo community doing, and what does their data look like compared to my data? And are there ways in which we could be doing a job better together that makes that data more useful downstream for everyone? And the paleo community has sort of jumped into that world to figure out how they can address it, as Amanda so nicely outlined. And the vision I had was that, there you go, would be, thanks Amanda in the chat, would be that every group would do this, right? That we would help the botany community do the same thing with botany data, et cetera. Somebody said to me, you should just go to GBIF and get 1 million records and make your own SQL database and look inside. Yes, thank you, Margaret. Yeah. This is exactly what I said. I said, okay, great. So then I do a good job of knowing what's in each one of those buckets and what that group does, but that really doesn't help someone who can't build that tool or resource for themselves, right?
Yeah, that's not a real practical solution.
That's not a real practical solution, right? And yet if we want people to be engaged, and Amanda, you can speak to this better than I can now because you've been doing what I envisioned and was pushing and encouraging Holly and Talia and Erica to do for so long, which was helping the paleo community to do what I just said. How could they help them look inside their databases and pull out those different piles of data and help them compare to each other and go, oh, and their eyes got really big, right? And then they started to see paths that they could take. It empowered them to be engaged the way that Deborah was talking about, right? It gave them something they could understand because it was directly relevant to their data that they understood and actions that they could take.
And that also speaks to the earlier question from Deb about, getting the community involved. We formed a group that, we were all like, we have all these problems with our data. How are you doing it? How are you doing it? And it started off as sort of one-off conversations with reaching out to other institutions with similar collections. And then we coalesce, like, Deb said that, Talia, Erica, and Holly, and a bunch of us got together and we meet every other week, and we've been doing so for over a year now. And we, this is our abstract that was submitted, and we're going through different, not just different TDWG or through different Darwin Core standards, but also just generalized problems in our community and what is and is not working for the data. And what do we need to look at a little bit more closely? And, we have some other representatives on other working groups or the task groups, so we can also pull in from some of that, to see like how can paleo give feedback back on some of these terms that are being discussed right now. And so we can at least have our group sort of at least start to look at it from the paleo perspective and get that feedback back into the whole machine of revising standards and everything.
So Amanda, thanks for that. I just remembered too. Ellie, would you share what you did? So to Margaret's question and Deborah's too, and others, when we put out the Darwin Core terms for review that were up for change, what did you do locally where you're at with your team? I think that's fascinating.
So I'm based in Australia and I work for the Atlas of Living Australia, for those who don't know. We did a few things. Locally in Australia, we have some quite active technical committees. So we have a committee, an Australia-wide committee for herbarium collection managers, another one for herbarium data managers, and we also have one for museum data managers as well. And they've all got acronyms that you may have heard floating around in the past. We've got FSIG and HISCOM are the two committees you may have heard of. So both of those committees got together and actually went through proposal by change by change by change, or proposal by proposal, to decide what the community thought about those particular proposals. And then one person put responses back into the GitHub issues. That was really, really good. It was a bit tedious to go through all of them, and we kind of gave up on some of the non-normative changes after a while and just went, oh yeah, that'll be fine. So just to focus our efforts a bit, but that was actually a really good way of engaging all of the data management community around Australia. Subsequent to that, once the changes were actually ratified, we've gone back and tried to do that again to say, or we're in the process of trying to do that again to say, okay, here are the changes that have gone through that you might not be aware of. So did you know, for example, that you can now have people identifiers in the form of Wikidata IDs or ORCIDs within your data set? So just at least the level of those committees, and then hopefully the committees will disseminate the data, the information back out into their communities. Is that what you meant, Deb? Is that the bit that you were thinking of, or were you thinking of something else?
It is beautiful. It is beautiful. That's exactly what I meant. Exactly. It's lovely.
But it would be great if everyone could apply that.
We hope that we will never have as large of a group of changes at once. We're going to try to keep ahead of it.
Yeah, that was a pretty big slab.
It was like a 3-year backlog at least.
Margaret, was that helpful?
Yes, it does sound like finding a community of advisors is the best way to go, at least. And so far for us, it's meant using our local GBIF node, which actually has just changed, had some personal changes recently. And also I go to the GBIF technical folks and ask them. For the most part, the response I get is, oh yeah, this looks fine, but I'm never quite sure if there isn't a better way to do it that I just haven't found yet. So and we are at a point in our coding where we can make some changes if it's the right thing to do. What I'm afraid of is that we'll write up all the code, we'll generate a few million records, and someone will come back and say, oh yeah, but you should have done it like this. And I would like to know that now, as opposed to a year from now or later. That's kind of the main thing that I'm thinking of.
Do you have on your EML board a technical advisor group that can help you with that question?
An EML, not that wouldn't be on the EML board. That would be in the repository. It's the repository that's creating these. EML is a broad. It operates more like TDWG as a group of people from a lot of different organizations. The group that's creating these data sets within the LTER, I would say no, we don't have a technical advisor who's a TDWG or who's a Darwin Core expert. No, we do not. We have me, who was not an expert by any stretch.
I think you can certainly find help in the TDWG community. We're here.
So yeah, I have started a few conversations around. I think that's where I'll go.
Where are you?
I'm in California, UC Santa Barbara.
Oh, and is LTER net part of the conversation that you're talking about?
Yes, because I work with a repository called the Environmental Data Initiative, EDI, which houses the LTER data, and we're an EML-based repository. So
yeah, if you find conflicts or gaps in the Darwin Core, if you have a good sense of what your on about, you know, the kind of data management that you have to undertake, the metadata that's important to you, the structures that you have, etc. But you don't find an easy translation into Darwin Core. I think, you know, from my perspective, I would love to hear about it.
Oh, great. Sure.
Because what we want to see, I think, in all of this is that communities that have overlap, you know, we are getting people from paleo, from, you know, citizen science, from, you know, long-term monitoring, from, you know, so there's overlaps to all these things, but we definitely don't want to exclude big chunks of data or have people, you know, carving off big swaths of things in order to fit in, so to speak. You know, it's
well, and that does tend to happen. I know it's with the conversion that we're doing. Actually, why I'm thinking of this, or well, I'm working on this right now, is we've had this major effort in the last few years to harmonize a lot of this very diverse data that comes out of these smaller research groups. Like LTER is small in one scope, but not in others. But the data that they handle and that they produce is very diverse, structurally and thematically, methods, everything. We're trying to harmonize certain classes of data. And one of them is community surveys, how people actually measure groups of populations in areas. And we just finished a paper on a model for doing this, a workflow model where we take incoming are these raw data. That's what we're calling it, raw data, but it's basically the LTER site has finished it. We converted it to another format, and now we're at the stage of finishing up turning it into Darwin Core archives. And that might be of interest to you because it does talk about, one of the things we talk about when we do this harmonization process is we looked at a lot of extant models for pulling data together. Most of these were research-based, but we did look at Darwin Core as well. And there is some discussion about what worked well, what didn't work well, and particularly what scientists were looking for, but they weren't finding in the existing models. Because what tends to happen is, what are you pointing to?
I'm pointing to Paula.
Oh, Paula. Hi, Paula.
Yeah. So Margaret, what you're saying sounds like very, very close to the work that we're doing in one of the task groups. So we're working on terms around what was published in a paper as humble core. It was meant to capture inventory and survey data, but we have been working for some months on it now, and we're planning to present a list of terms to be an extension to Darwin Core for those kind of data. So we might want to get in touch, and of course you're invited to our meetings. We do it every 2 weeks now, every 2 Wednesdays. But if you would like, we could get in touch and see how we can link our works. You're muted, Margaret.
Sorry, one of my collaborators has, he put in an abstract for a poster to the TDWG meeting on our harmonization project. So you might see it, you'll see it go by it. I'm sure there's a reference to the paper in there too.
I'll be following up on
no,
that.
Paula, that would be really interesting to do. Thank you.
So this has been very, very interesting discussions in this session. I want to alert you all that we're past the hour for several minutes, so I don't want to get anyone stuck in the meeting. But I'm personally super happy with these discussions. I don't know if any of you want to make some final remarks, and then if you want, we can just stop the recording. If you want to keep discussing that, that will be fine.